Good morning, everyone. We're delighted to be here to discuss a panel on unlocking the value in sustainable real estate. We recognize this is the last panel of the day, so congratulate you for making it this far and really appreciate your time. Looking forward to a lively discussion with my expert panelists. As mentioned, I'm Romina Aversi. I head up Sustainable Investment Banking for the Americas at Crédit Agricole Corporate Investment Bank, and I'll hand it over to the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then we will dive into our discussion today.
So, wonderful, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for hosting us here. I'm Jameson Friedland. I'm the Sustainability Analyst at AXA Investment Managers, a global asset management firm that is in a variety of asset classes, including real estate. We manage about $900 billion in AUM for both the insurance group, AXA Group, the parent company, as well as for third-party clients.
Thanks, Jamie. Hello, everyone. Bonjour. C'est bon matin. Sunita, je travaille à la caisse. Alors, enchantée d'être ici ce matin pour avoir cette discussion très importante avec vous. Comme vous avez entendu, you've heard my colleague at the previous session, Adriana, and I'm sure you've heard my other two colleagues, Bertrand and Marc-André, over the last few days. So I won't give you too much on la CDPQ, but what I can tell you is sustainable investing forms part of what we do at La Caisse. It is part of everyone's responsibility and integrated directly into our business in how we invest, how we manage, how we finance, how we dispose. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion more focused on real estate with this esteemed panel this morning.
Hi, my name is Natalie Volin. I am one of the founders of a company called Groupe Danu, as well as the history of Gestion Immobilière Quo Vadis. We are real estate developers throughout Quebec. And we build based on a triple bottom line. We're a B Corp, and what we do is we build accessible, multi-res, carbon neutral housing. And so I think that the discussion that we're going to have today is really based on the what, when, where, how, and why. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you all.
Excellent. Well, with that, we will dive right into the first topic of our panel, demystifying the key barriers and decision makers for development and the integration of sustainability in real estate. So, Natalie, can we start off talking a bit about what are the key barriers, the risks in real estate and their connection to climate? Can you walk us through some of those?
Yes, so I'm also part of something called the Next Generation Cities Institute at Concordia University. I'm just finishing my PhD because I thought that I had nothing else to do in my career. So what we're trying to do is blend best practices in academia and directly into our real estate practice. And I think that that's really fun about how we were able to identify through research and market about what the key barriers were. So I'm old school. I still use cue cards as opposed to my colleagues that are much more tech oriented. So physical and regulatory risk is something that we have to look at every time we do any kind of due diligence in looking at properties. So years ago, we never looked at flood zones or problems with infrastructure. Does the city have enough sewage system and piping to be able to service our properties? Also, what type of energy is available? So in Quebec, we're lucky to have Hydro-Quebec, but we don't have enough capacity to be able to do all of our projects on a full renewable basis in the way that business is done today. So sometimes we even have to look at when we're buying our properties, how much energy do we have that's available for each of the type of units that we're trying to build. So I think that the physical risks are really also based on water management. No matter what your stance is on climate, rain is falling faster, longer, and at a much higher rate than ever before. So when we're talking about risk analysis, it's super important to look at like, how are your buildings going to stand up over time? And there's enough science out there to be able to look at what are the climate risks as far as extreme heat, extreme cold, forest fires. You look at that, like these are type of things that real estate developers usually in the past didn't have to deal with on a daily basis. Now we do, even if you're looking at physical risk and linking it directly to insurance costs, as an example. The regulatory risk, one of the main issues, and we discussed this the other day with our colleagues, wherever you are, the rules are all different. So whether you're building in Quebec, different cities have different regulatory requirements. They have different key targets. And the process of the regulatory change of zoning is totally different everywhere. So there's a problem for real estate developers who are going in and trying to figure out what they can build, how they can build it, and what documents and what things that they need to have to prepare. They're all different. So every time you go into a new market, you really have to do your homework. So it's not predictable. And when real estate developers and investors and banks don't like no predictable outcomes. And I've said this before on many occasions, money for investment is liquid. So if a city is too difficult to build, they'll go somewhere else to build, which doesn't really help the affordability or the type of amount of units that are required per city. When we're talking about financial risk, there's a lot of them, but I'll just hone it down on 3. So there is a ton of technology out there to be able to decarbonize our properties quicker, better, and more efficiently. The problem is that there's a large amount of capital upfront cost to be able to do that. And so by the time that the return on this investment of these capital investments in decarbonization your buildings, the problem is who gets that benefit? Often developers will be out either right away because they are building condos. If you're building multi-res, often a hold will be between 5 and 7 years, maybe sometimes longer. And some of these paybacks are too long in the capital infrastructure. So it's super important to be able to figure out what technology that you could get de-risking your property as quick as possible. Obviously, you have a reduction of your operating expenses, but then the problem is, again, if it's too long, you can't calculate that in your performas. For capital, investors totally want you to build carbon neutral, affordable housing, but they still want market returns. So it's kind of fun to be able to do that, but like, how do you do that on a scale that makes sense? So we really need to figure out how can we change our business plans in a way to include certain indicators that weren't included before. For valuation, a lot of the evaluators don't even look at the increased value of a property that is actually climate resilient. They don't have enough comparables. They're not willing to put that into the documentation. And so the problem is that you're not pricing for carbon, energy efficiency, or any of that directly into these properties. For operational and market risk, because of these higher capital costs, it all links together. The financial plans don't work. And I can't tell you how many times we've heard it doesn't pencil. I don't even know what the pencil means, but we're going to say that it's really important to understand that it's the business plan that needs to be adapted, because right now the technology's out there, the know-how's out there. This is a people problem. This is not a technical problem. This is about how do we make decisions, stick by them, and I think we're pretty smart as a collective society to be able to figure out how to work it out. There's a lot of perceptions around greenwashing. So many developers now say that they're building green, and then you really push a little bit, and what they're really talking about is they put car charging stations. You're like, you're putting car charging stations because tenants have cars that they need to charge. This is not a green investment opportunity. But the biggest problem and risk, and I'll finish on this, is about data, standards, reporting, the learning curve, and making sure that you are adopting based on learning. Because people who say that they're climate experts, that doesn't exist. We are all in a transition, we're all trying to figure it out, and we all have our own recipe, and often we don't share. So I think these conferences are super awesome, whether it's here or sitting outside where we start comparing things. And I think that the unusual suspects about being able to work directly with investors and things like that before are really indicating success in your projects moving forward.
No, wonderful. I think your points are absolutely spot on, Natalie. And I think that, sort of going back to some of the first points you made about the physical and the regulatory risk, to your point, from an investor perspective, that continuity is also critical, because we're going to see, you mentioned the sort of different climates will have different regulatory environments. Those regulatory or zoning requirements can also change based on different climate events that happen. And so you look around, coming from the US perspective, you look around areas like that were hit for, in different hurricanes, and now they require that all the coastal properties be built on stilts, or now in the wildfires that we've seen out in California, they're now saying that they need to be built in a certain way in order to be fire resilient. And so not only is it, there's different zoning in each particular area, but each different area, depending on the circumstances that happen, will have changes to their zoning requirements very quickly. And so, you get very uncomfortable perhaps very quickly as an investor because you're seeing developers, REITs, everything being built in these areas, and you expect a somewhat predictable return, and then you go, well, now all of our costs and all of our inputs went up, so maybe our returns are going to be significantly different than they looked like before.
I don't think I'm going to add to the conversation. I think we should go to the next question.
So going to the next question, an ever-present challenge in the space, pricing, returns, and the alignment of stakeholders to that point. Sunita, can you discuss what is causing all of the stakeholders to be on a vastly different page related to pricing? Are we pricing the impact of sustainability into our models today? Help us in how we should think through this next barrier.
Thank you, Romina. So maybe, in addressing this, you've talked about some of the barriers, and I think one of the things that we really look for is alignment. And when I say alignment, you need alignment within the industry, you need alignment within your stakeholders, your partners. And you brought up one important point, or seen as a barrier, is valuation. Are we really looking at apples to apples as an industry, as a market, whatever asset class you're thinking about? Are the valuators waiting for regulation? Or are they waiting for the industry to move? So today, in terms of your asset and different asset classes, how are you measuring whether that asset is aligned in terms of a 1.5 degrees alignment? Is it an asset that is stranded? We in 2020 invested in a tool called CREM to allow us to measure, to see where an asset sits vis-a-vis the alignment. And today, it's a tool that we use, but in looking at an asset, and you go back to data and technology, that's also a challenge in terms of how do you measure this? How do you figure out, okay, my building is stranded today. What is it going to take to get it aligned to follow that pathway to 1.5 degrees? What kind of capital am I going to require? What's the value of that capital? Where is the return that I'm going to get? As long-term investors, obviously, we have a fiduciary duty to be managing our assets long-term, making sure that we maintain value, let alone maybe go seek a premium on that. So how are we pricing the value of carbon is something that's very interesting to us in real estate. You may have known that Ivanhoe Cambridge was integrated into La Caisse de dépôt last year, so I've spent a lot of time in real estate, and I'm very excited to be inside La Caisse, to be looking at this even from a different lens. But pricing carbon is not an easy thing, and trying to get alignment in the industry, there are so many certifications, standards, there's so many great things out there, but we can't do everything. So how do we get stakeholder buy-in to align on certain things? So we've developed an internal tool that we call our Green IRR to measure, to simulate the impact of carbon pricing on valuation. So whether you're factoring in a tax that you could be looking at, whether you're factoring in a penalty if you're not following a regulation, for example, there's regulations in place. What does that look like? How are you looking at your asset from a leasability standpoint? Do tenants want to be in a building that doesn't have good air quality, that has bad lighting? I don't. I know I've worked in a building that hasn't been great in a long time ago, obviously, but are we responding to the market, and how is that impacting the price and the value of an asset? That's something that's really important to look at. Even from a financing perspective, are we factoring in, if our building is obsolete, if a lender is looking at that and they're saying, well, why would I lend to you? Or if I lend to you, there's more risk. So maybe there's an incentive, we hear the story about the carrot or the stick, maybe there's an incentive to get a green financing loan to decarbonize or to create that value more long-term. So these are just some of the examples, but we're simulating this, and we're also working very closely with the industry, both locally here, also more broadly in Europe and abroad. We work very closely with ULI, who's working on a tool that will hopefully be launched in the market to start measuring these things and to start pricing carbon appropriately, so that we're looking at an asset from apples to apples. Because you could be surprised when you're putting an asset on the market and you have it valued at X price and it's obsolete or it's not aligned. Is the buyer going to give you that price? Or does the buyer say, well, hold on a minute, I need to do X, Y, and Z, whether that's replacing equipment. You're not going to just replace same equipment with the same equipment. You're going to need to look at what's more energy efficient, what's going to reduce my operating costs. So Those kind of things, are they priced in today? Or are you as an owner, investor, going to be surprised when the market's not willing to pay what you think your asset's worth? I'll say another thing in terms of the user. So our strategies need to be defined by the end user. So we think about human. We're all human. We interact. We're in this great building today. We're not fist pumping. We're not dancing, but we're connecting. There's a great energy
yet.
in this building. For what I've known this building to be. But anyhow, what I mean is, the human beings want to be in a place where they feel good. When I think of it as an employer, why do you want your employees to feel good? Or why do you want your employees to be, to find themselves in this space, to feel a sense of belonging, or to feel connected, or to have good lighting? It's because you want them to feel good, because if you feel good, you're engaged. And if you're engaged, you're productive. And if you're productive, you're contributing to the bottom line. And that's the most important thing to remember when we think about the value and what it's worth. When we think about, again, our leasability, we do have tenants that are asking, what's the carbon footprint? What's the strategy? What's happening with this asset? What are the amenities? What's the health and wellness program look like? So all these things, they have a value. And there's a study that we look at very often. It's an MIT study that, the conclusion is that if you focus, there are things that are focused on wellness that can warrant higher rents, which can translate into higher value for a building. That's just one example. I don't know if my colleagues want to add in.
No, I think your comment about stranded assets is incredibly critical, and I think that there's also different ways to think about the stranded asset sort of issue at large. You have obviously the area where technologically, we might be that technology or that asset might become obsolete based on what's going on. So think about a coal plant right now that's being optimized to be converted into a natural gas facility. So that's a version of sort of that obsolescence that's there. The stranded assets can also happen even sort of pre-build effectively. If you think about the interconnectedness or the interconnection needed to get to Natalie's earlier point about grids of, right now in the US, you're sitting in some places a 5-year wait list just to get connected to a grid in order to be able to have the energy supply you need. So you're thinking about large-scale data centers being built or other infrastructure type projects. Well, that becomes almost, it's a stranded asset because the developer is going to have to sit there and wait for a number of years before they're seeing any kind of revenue at the other end. And then finally, you have the area of the stranded asset where even if your particular building or your particular asset is resilient or can be resilient in the face of different climate scenarios, the area that they are in may not be. So it's wonderful that your building is able to withstand a different climate scenario, but it doesn't do you a lot of good either as an owner or as an investor if the whole area is flooded, and yes, your building survived and didn't flood, and that's wonderful, but it's not going to be usable, it's not going to be revenue generating, and therefore, it's stranded from a regionally perspective, based on different climate scenarios. So there's, lots of sort of risks there from an investor lens that need to be thought of. And then on the insurance side, obviously we're owned by an insurance company. All of these issues become the other side of that coin to say, okay, how do I deal with some of these problems from an insurance lens? Yes, that's why we require the building to then be built on stilts, or we require the different HVAC systems or backup systems to be built on the roof instead of the basement in order to make them more flood resilient. But there are definitely areas where the insurance industry is pulling back from even being able to comfortably get able to assess the risk, and you're seeing that from a variety of regions and a variety of climates, that we're seeing the insurance companies just not being able to appropriately model that risk, and so how that becomes an impact to say, how do you build something if you can't get insurance for that area? And that really, kind of kills a lot of projects in their infancy.
Just to maybe add what you were saying around wellness. We do see it in the commercial office space that tenants are asking for strategies, policies. What are you doing even about waste and energy efficiency? So I could see that, but I don't necessarily have yet seen it in the residential multi-res area. It is almost assumed that a new building will be built well. And it seems that buildings mostly are built based to building code. Cool. However, the building code doesn't necessarily have the updates yet to look at climate resiliency. And if you're talking about air quality, as an example, when you're living in your apartment, you assume that the developer has figured that out. But if you really dig deep, and you're laughing because I know you know what I'm talking about, unfortunately, some of these new buildings, once you live in them for a couple years, you start realizing that they weren't built for the long term. A lot of the older buildings were built in a very different standard to last. I don't understand exactly where real estate turned into something that you would replace over time. So when you're looking at somebody who's buying a condo and they have to replace their HVAC systems or their roofs or their windows within 5 to 10 years, that's crazy. If you're looking at circular economy and waste and reinvestment, it costs money to buy more stuff. So I think that it's super cool that it's moving in the office world right now about being driven by the end user. The multi-res or the tenants that are living in apartments assume it, but they don't want to pay for more. So the other thing about valuation is that we assume that buildings are worth more because tenants are more willing to pay more. But that talks about a little bit of issues around climate justice when you're looking at housing. It makes sense in office because there's lots of different opportunities. But when you're looking at housing and you're trying to do green buildings and affordable, all of a sudden now you have an issue. Because when you're looking at green, often they're more expensive. And when you're looking at affordable, they're built badly. So how do you actually make those things tie all together?
And before I move on to the next question, Sunita, you mentioned a point that really stood out to me from the perspective of a bank is green incentivization. And many banks, European banks, we have our own internal liquidity discounts in order to incentivize certain green lending. The question for the banks then becomes, are we actually transparent enough on what these liquidity discounts are? In many cases, they are internal. There are certain grids, there are certain guidelines, and those may or may not make their way into the pricing that we then offer to our borrowers. Well, why not? And then why do some banks have those discounts and some don't? Are we fully discussing the inputs into these discounts with the actual experts in the field who are the real estate developers? I would say we're probably not extensively discussing them as much as we could be in terms of wellness and the bottom line that may make. So I think it really is a big ecosystem of the developers, the investors, and the lenders on our side of how can we create a better carrot stick situation from the money that we're ultimately lending out. Which leads me to my next question for Jameson. Can you speak a little bit about the hurdles you face as an investor in real estate globally, comparing, contrasting Americas versus Europe with a focus on data?
Absolutely. And I think that's, as a sort of larger investor, we're fortunate in the sense that we're able to sort of do some of these challenges at a different scale, but then we face a very different set of hurdles, is getting comfortable with understanding exactly what the investment is going into. So, to think about even just very, very simply, you have the EPC credits in Europe, and everyone will kind of have a standard that they say, I only want to invest in a REIT or in a bank that's financing green buildings up to a certain standard. That's fantastic. However, that simple set of standards is different country to country, even within Europe. And so what might be an EPC A in one country will be the equivalent of an EPC C in a different country. And so all of a sudden your standard that you think is going to be a very simple way to say we have uniformity in our holdings now becomes really, really difficult when you're trying to do this at a scale. And that's focusing on one standard in one region. Now amplify this on a global level. And so to compare LEED standards versus BREEAM versus something that's happening in Asia or Australia, South Africa, and there's so many different green building standards, which is wonderful that they've all moved towards having some sort of standard process, but having that comparability is extremely challenging for investors. And so the second part of that is even when you have a standard and even when you can get comfortable to say X equals Y and this will be my standard level, sometimes you just don't have the data there. So, again, going back into the EPC, there are certain countries where they're only eligible to get an EPC once the building is transferred or sold or some sort of process has happened. So if you're a bank who has a large, residential real estate portfolio of mortgages that you've loaned against, and you want to see what your EPC holdings might look like, well, half of them might not have any credits, standards put on them because there hasn't been a transfer of that property. And so, trying to understand that operationally becomes very, very difficult, particularly as an investor who might be 1 or 2 steps removed from the actual sort of development process.
I agree with you. It's a challenge. I think one thing that, depending again on what role you're playing, I think one thing you can do, and you see differences in different parts of the world, is where you see there is a good practice, or you see that there's a way to gain that data or to influence that practice. I think we look to try to bring those good practices throughout our portfolio. Obviously, we have a portfolio that's it's around the world, and it is not true in terms of it's not apples to apples, or you're not getting the same level of data. For example, in a certain asset class, an industrial asset class, for example, sometimes a lot of the data is coming from the tenant. If you want to measure, emissions, impact, energy, efficiency, all of that, you need to get that from the user. What we've done, and we find it has worked and does work, we do incentivize our tenants via our lease clauses to provide that data to us. And we introduced, green lease clauses many, many, many years ago, but we can only continue to enhance them. So that's a way to gain that data, is to incentivize, obviously, or through your lease negotiations. It's back to the governance piece. I think that's that's probably the most important piece, is the governance, is how do we connect all this, or how do we gain that data as an institutional owner? We do have asset managers, we do have reporting requirements, but are those enshrined in our agreements? Do we have quarterly reports, or data changes so quickly, maybe you want it every 3 months. But I think that's the governance is key in all of this. And just back to Romina's point, because I had to address it in terms of is there transparency on the lending side or on the banking side? Maybe there can be more, but I think we need to incentivize the entire value chain. So when you think about the tenants, you think about the suppliers, you think about the lenders, you think about the managers. We also need to think about ourselves as employers. We have implemented, compensation connected to performance on sustainability, and that holds us true in terms of walking the talk. But I think that all those things connected will hopefully unlock a little bit more access to that data and allow us to measure better.
So when we're talking about measurements as a developer, sometimes we're not really sure as to what bank or what lender or what investor needs what KPI to measure what. So there's a lot of different things that you could do around sustainability. Some people are really interested in water mitigation. Some are about making sure that you have long-term lower operating costs because you're using less energy. Other people are just like, we don't really care about your energy costs. We just want you to use green energy as opposed to not. So it's complicated because at the same time, we're trying to figure out that formula as developers, but we obviously need investors to scale, and we need finance to be able to make our projects work. So we could do one project and do it all by ourselves, or we could do many projects and scale our impact by working with more investors and different things. So when you're talking about your transparency, sometimes we have gone to different kinds of either banks or lenders, and they also have all different standards as to what they want to measure. And I also don't think we need to all measure the same thing. Because there are different climate zones. Like in Quebec, we are really hot and really cold, which is very different than, let's say, Barcelona, which has a different kind of energy grid, or even Vancouver in the same country. We have different ways of using mechanicals. So I'm not sure that I want to understand the whole concept of standardization. I just want to be able to know who does what. And the problem is, how do we then connect who's doing what with who needs what? So I think that I know that there's a lot of talk around standardization. I'm a little worried about that because I feel that all these things, these certifications should be toolboxes. Sometimes LEED works, sometimes BREEAM, sometimes net zero building for carbon through national, So I don't know if I want a standard because a long time ago, only LEED was the standard and that didn't work for existing buildings. Now they do, they've totally changed that and now it's available for both. Well, it was always available, but it was just too cost prohibitive to do that. So I don't know if I want to do standardization. I just want to understand, what do you need so that I can measure it and I can deliver it and then I can scale with you.
Yeah, no, and I think that's true across, the ESG data space at large. I think is, we get it from all of our, investees sort of end up saying we have to fill out 6, 7, 10, 15 different data questionnaires from different data providers who all have slightly different ways of wording things, slightly different questions that they're asking. There might be 70, 80% of that will be a standard response, but then there will be bespoke stuff. So it's definitely I think a fine line because there is different information that different people will need. Not every investor will care about every critical issue that a different investor might, and so there is room to have that differentiation. The way to do, there needs to be that balance to make sure that we're not putting such an onerous burden on developers or on sort of the actual data owners, in some cases the tenants or whoever it is, to be able to say, here's something that you can report in, let the investors pick which of the data they're going to get. But there needs to be something, of the way to say, this does compare across jurisdictions and across regions, so that the large-scale investors can get comfortable with the nuances of the different geographies.
Moving on to our second topic, we talked quite a bit about the barriers, risks, challenges. We'll switch more a bit on the opportunities, unlocking value, and I'll turn to Sunita for this question. How would you describe the path towards value creation alignment in terms of investing capital, generating strong returns, doing good? What does this mean in terms of blended finance model, things such as public-private partnerships? Speak to us a bit about that in light of the barriers that we also just discussed over the last half hour.
Thank you. I think we're at a very interesting time, I'd say, in the world as a country. Right now, there's a lot of noise out there, and it's really, sometimes it's challenging. How do you differentiate between what's a signal, what's a noise? Where is the opportunity today in terms of sustainability, and where should we be investing? What are those opportunities looking like? And, from a personal perspective, it's interesting how our real estate portfolio is now integrated inside CDPQ, and we're also, interacting and having those unintended collisions with our colleagues in different asset classes and seeing, are there opportunities? Where do we connect the dots? People talk a lot about infrastructure and real estate, infrastructure straddling real estate. What are the opportunities there? Can we look at energy as a service? Is there a way to, reduce those operating costs, looking at renewables? So I think there's a few examples of opportunity and value creation. You talked about blended finance. I think, again, back to, as a country today, the interprovincial relations and, seeing the opportunities that lie within our country are probably more important than ever. Is it a time for the private sector and the public sector to be working and collaborating together even more? I think so. I think, different stakeholders have different expectations and different, risk return requirements or expectations and needs they have to meet. I think there's great opportunity to be looking at those different opportunities and different stakeholders around the table to see, hey, you know what? I've got a product, I've got X, you've got Y. How do we get a meeting of the minds and create value here? Because I think we're probably sitting on a lot more opportunity than we realize. Back to generating good and generating the returns at the same time. That's really about the alignment. It's if you are doing good, you should be generating those returns. And, we do listen to our depositors, we listen to our pensioners, we meet with them, we hear them, and, this is the future and their retirement, so we're very careful in terms of how we're creating and maintaining that value for them. So it is our responsibility to be, making sure we're listening to what's a signal and not necessarily, listening to the noise and getting out there and taking those opportunities and taking those risks.
And Jameson, on your side, from an investor point of view, a similar question, value creation in terms of your investment thesis, how do you think through that in response to Sunita's comments?
No, I think you're exactly right. There's definitely significant opportunities there. We are a large, actual asset owner in the sense of our properties, having, I think, over 2,500 properties globally, variety of different types of properties. And so there becomes, I think, lots of conversations that need to and do happen around, how are there differences to be able to say, yes, this is a industrial facility, but it's also near or similarly linked to an infrastructure. So, let's bring in opportunities around that. And think about the adding value. We talked earlier about, the client or the end client ends up, wanting a higher, or is willing to pay a higher price for a premium building. There's lots of, I think, opportunities that we've done there from a value creation standpoint, whether that be, improving the energy efficiency in order to attract clients who have that as part of their mandates. But then it's also part of our internal goals. So we've set our process to say that we're going to have these decarbonization targets, and so we actively are moving towards having these decarbonization processes and conversations at our various properties. And yes, we are much more a long-term owner in these properties, but they will turn over and we will acquire new properties, and so there needs to be opportunities that we are not just enhancing them for our own decarbonization goals, but enhancing them so that there is that potential value creation from the sale point. So, some of our internal processes, we've really gone through and are effectively trying to optimize where we see both the low-hanging fruit in many cases. It could be as simple as fixing insulation on a building in order to make it more energy efficient, or changing some of the scaffolding or windows, to something much more complex at a CapEx level. And so figuring out some of those optimization challenges is something that we're internally looking through, but is definitely an area that we are seeing as an opportunity to add value to our own portfolio, and therefore, yes, make the buildings more energy efficient or more resilient from a climate standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint.
I think that value is often equated only with return. And I think that there's a different conversation now, especially after COVID, about, how do I want to live my life? So we've seen that the office industry has changed completely. The only people that are going to the office are offices that are awesome offices that people want to go to. And so the crappy offices are no longer being occupied the same way because there's other options. And I think that in the residential world, I think we also need to be able to adopt to value creation. People want to sit outside. Whose job is it to build a park? Why can't it be a developer's opportunity to build a park? Why? The Jan Gehl Institute from Copenhagen has been around for 50 years, and they clearly have studies that demonstrate that people are wanting to live in buildings that are next to nature. But we don't always look at that because we're thinking, like, why am I paying for landscaping? And if you really look at the financial budget, what gets cut when you have cost overrides in your mechanical system or whatever? It's going to be the amount of trees that you plant. But the fact is that buildings fill quicker next to nature than they don't. So there is a cost to keeping buildings empty or not optimally rented. But value creation could also be common areas on the ground floor that maybe during, energy crisis, that you have a common kitchen downstairs that people can come and be part of each other. If you also look at a book called Happy City that was written based on a study in Berlin, Mumbai, and New York City, and they're talking about the amount of people that now live by themselves. There's a huge amount of people that are single users in apartments, and they're isolated. And there's some really good stories in that book, but what retained as information to me is how do we create those, you talked about collisions. So how do we create our public space in a way that people feel like they're a sense of a community? Why is that important? Because we're in rental properties and we want to make sure that people continue to renew their lease. And people are going to renew their lease when they're engaged in something that matters to them, because we actually cared enough to put generators on, common areas so that when there's a hydro crisis or whatever, that people are able to be together and be taken care of. So I think that value creation needs to be a little bit enlarged. beyond just how do I sell, because not enough of these cool types of buildings are being traded yet. So we can't even define that yet, but we can define how quickly people rent a building and how often they renew with us, as opposed to leaving and then having to re-rent something. So I think value needs to be enlarged.
I think you're bang on, and I think, not to call it a sleeve, but one of the
Inside jokes.
That's an inside joke with us. But one of the products that we've invested in is a co-living product, actually. We've started in Europe. It's expanded, but it has presence in the U.S. as well. But that's an interesting asset class, the co-living asset class. And whether it's student housing or younger living or whatnot, I think you raise a very, very valid point. And what's the value in that? And what are people looking for? Going back to, are we responding to the market and society and the needs? And
can you be proud of what you build?
Yeah.
And I think, bringing it almost full circle is some of this can also be done at the zoning and the regulation standpoint. You see in cities like Paris where they're changing the way the streets are being set up so that there are more green spaces. And now, yes, they're turning areas that are more accessible for public transport or for bikes or other walking paths. And so you're seeing areas where opportunities to gather, yes, in the building itself, but also in the nearby areas. And so that gives that opportunity for a sense of community, but that needs to be done, not just from, investors, developers, and banks pressuring, but, also the different jurisdictions from that responsibility to say, we want to entice our customers, we want to bring more clients or more residents into our city, and so we're going to change some of the regulation, and that will give, I think, opportunities for developers to be able to then say, well, this is great, yes, I can build in addition to this green space, but I can also take advantage of the green spaces that are being developed by the different jurisdictions.
So in Europe as well, there's different examples where municipalities that have invested in green streets are more attractive to developers to come in and build, because it actually reduces energy cost to have a green infrastructure, is what they call it. So it's not only just to invest in trees because your community looks better, cool, like you feel better. There's actually a direct link that if you have a mature tree that is a certain size next to a building, the cost of energy is lower. Yeah. And we have an energy crisis, and we've talked about it a lot. Whatever energy source that you use, green or not, we do not have enough power to build what we need to build by 2050. We're at a 50% deficit, and they did talk about it day one. For those who have seen it, there was a cool chart that was put on there. So we have to be more efficient, and what you were saying is developers need to do it, lenders, investors, city, municipalities. When people ask, whose responsibility is it to do? And I'm like, my answer is just yes. Everyone's responsibility.
With that, we will leave 5 minutes for questions at the end, so start thinking about your questions. But before we get to that, we'll do a rapid fire round of last words, thinking about the future of real estate, any calls to action, just a few sentences on what would you like to leave the audience with today? What's the most important key takeaways, call to actions? I'll start with Natalie.
I was hoping I would be last.
Oh, then I'll start with Jameson.
No, I'm good. I do talk about it a lot with our partners. I will never build something that I won't live in. And I think that sometimes we look at performas and documents about, does it work well on a spreadsheet in a conference room? And I think it's really important that, like, a lot of us have kids or no kids or whatever. Can you figure out the business plan? Be smart enough to be nimble, figure your stuff out, calculate your numbers different, become an advocate and a storyteller so that your investors and your lenders get what you're saying. Measure it, be real, be transparent. I can't do everything, but this is what I do very, very well. And then whatever you do very well, figure out how to do the next thing and do that very well. So we talked about AI as well. We really need to look at how do we continuously learn to do things that we're changing business as usual today, but for the future moving forward. And I think that real estate has been a little bit lazy with how we build for a long time, and it's up to all of us to be able to be creative and awesome and leave our own legacy. You're never too young or too old to leave something behind that was better than yesterday.
Me?
Benita?
Okay, I've been saying this a lot lately, and you might hear it. Mother Nature, she's not going away. Sometimes she's happy, sometimes she's not happy at all. And you can ignore it, or you can do something about it. And you talk about legacy. I think if you all took a piece of paper and wrote down your legacy, what would people say about you? How did you behave? Think about that. And if there's anything that you can do that's within your control, I say go for it. And, I would say have the courage to take the risk and make a difference.
I think that's great advice. I think the area that we sometimes get caught up in, and in all aspects of our lives, is we try to figure out, to your point, how does this solve for the boardroom or for the area? And so, we want to get the perfect answer. I think it's often, and I think real estate is a very easy opportunity for this to be directionally right, not necessarily to a specific target. There's so many different challenges that you can address. There's so many different areas that you can improve. You don't necessarily need to know quantifiably exactly, yes, as an investor, we absolutely want that data and crave that data, but there's definitely, we can see in our investee companies, we can see those who really just believe in this at a core ethos versus those who are just saying, well, we've hit these data metrics and this is our target and we're going to move forward. And you can see the way people talk about it. They get excited about it. They get engaged, and all of a sudden they perk up a little bit, and all of a sudden this matters to them. Yep. And so, having that directional travel and having that ability to move forward, you will leave a better legacy by being incrementally just a little bit better each day. And so, we talked about a lot of the challenges, but I think there is so much growth and opportunity to go forward as well.
Stand up.
With that, we have a few minutes for questions in the audience. Any questions? Okay, I see a few.
Yeah, I will.
Hi, thank you for the presentations, very interesting. I'm Marjane Rabat from ETS, professor. My question is how potential future created value, if you can measure it, are integrated in your financial models to value the project, the real estate project, and eventually your exit value for an institution like CDPQ, for example. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. As I was mentioning, so we're working on, how do we integrate this value into our underwriting in, today on the value and on exit. So some of the factors that I talked to you about in our Green IRR simulation today, we're looking at. However, we do integrate where an asset sits on the creme curve today. That is integrated into whether it's an acquisition or an asset management underwriting, it is looked at. So we do know, depending on the strategy and the exit strategy, the exit date, where that asset will sit, and then we will evaluate what kind of capital needs to go in to align that asset so that we can capture and maintain that value on exit. So that much I can tell you, but it's complicated and it's not standardized. So this is an internal simulation right now. We hope that we will, as a market, be able to launch something that's used by all, and we're looking at the same numbers.
I think I saw another question. Yep.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I was wondering, over the whole week, we've heard in a lot of different presentations that people that are actually building projects or acting on the ground, they're all asking for be able to have a predictable rules, KPIs, comparables. You've talked about that today. My question would be, from where do you expect that this leadership actually to come from? From states, from investors from the industry or any other participant?
Yes.
I think to maybe elaborate a little bit more, it does need to come from everywhere. There's I think there's definitely coalitions and working groups across various industries and across different opportunities where there are opportunities for investors to get in a room together and say, from these are the KPIs we want. There's opportunities for the different government agencies or states to be able to say, this is how we're going to be able to pass this standard going forward. There's a limit, I think, to some degree on what's that predictability, as we've seen with different climate scenarios where our best intentions to predict are not necessarily always able to fully. So there does need to be, I think, some appetite for flexibility, but there's room in all of these different areas for conversations that happen in silos, but then also, at the broader level altogether.
There's certainly a role to play from the bank side in that, in terms of what KPIs would we like to see for lending. Back to the point of incentivization, how are we incentivizing the lending that we're doing for green real estate based on our internal decarbonization goals that we have to align to, not only for lending but also for underwriting? What do those KPIs look like? So I very much think it is an ecosystem across all the different parties, and the banks play a significant role in that as well.
I think the worst thing you could do is sit and wait. You can't do that. So I think, again, a combined stakeholder movement, but doing nothing is not the answer, because the cost of doing nothing is very high.
We have a few more minutes left in case there are any other questions in the room. I see one in the back. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Natalie, Jameson, you both talked about the way that regions and municipalities can sort of foster a climate where green building and environmentally efficient building is more supported, but also about some of the challenges of how new zoning codes or new regulations can hinder development in certain contexts. Can you talk about how the best way to navigate that path forward is, given the competing challenges that are being faced?
So I was part of the climate plan for the city of Montreal. I was one of the only private developers that was there. And we were really trying to argue or figure out exactly how that would affect the real estate industry, because the Montreal Climate Plan, for those of you that have taken a look at it, it has 5 different sectors, and one of them is real estate. So obviously, I would love to be able to influence mobility, but I personally can't. So I can only do what's in my limit of control. I think one of the biggest things that we had mentioned from the Climate Action Plan, there was something called the Partenariat Climat de Grand Montréal, which is supposed to be the operational strategy and actors that are going to put this Climate Action Plan directly into place. And one of the concepts was seeing the barrier that so many different municipalities in Montreal alone, never mind if you look at across Quebec or Canada or the States or whatever, they're all different. So the idea was, how do we standardize some of the key parts so that it becomes predictable so we could figure this out? And we tried to come up with this concept called a guichet unique. I'm not exactly sure how that translates into English, but an idea where somebody, if you're building a green building that is above and beyond what is required currently by law, that you should be able to have a fast track zoning, that you're supposed to have bonus density so that we can actually make our returns. And everybody has those key conversations. Unfortunately, I have not yet seen it systematically be put into place. So we still continue to navigate, and especially for us, we're in different cities around Quebec, and it's always okay, what is required, what document? There are some that are standard, but some aren't. But we've also noticed that outside of Montreal, we've seen a much larger receptibility, where people are saying to us from the city and the zoning and the urban planning people, we're not asking you to have a water mitigation strategy, but we're really super excited that you're doing that, because our infrastructure needs to be updated with better resiliency on using, our sewer systems better. So we've actually seen that our zoning is less prohibitive than some of the cities that have lots of regulation. Maybe that's just different to us because we're building differently. But I feel that there needs to be a good recipe. I talk a lot about recipes in some of the conversations that I have. Like, what is the best carrot and stick ratio? What are the base minimums that you absolutely should have? I also had some conversations with people that are creating the building code adjustments. Unfortunately, it takes a very long time to have a building code change. And then by the time that it's changed, it's almost outdated. So I think that there also needs to be a little bit more agility for people, again, that are building above and beyond what is required to do that. And we've even seen it with like CMHC, as far as Lenders Canada Housing, about having a point system to allow better financing opportunities for people who are building better. So I think it's happening. Like we did a deal with the National Bank, where we created like the first green loan associated to a heritage building. So, the conversations we've had with Crédit Agricole have been pretty amazing with, CDBQ. Everybody who's standing on stage has drank the Kool-Aid, So it's about time now that you guys influence the people that you're working with to not necessarily wait for regulation. And I know that everybody says we need more regulation. It makes me a little nervous. But because then I think that more people will not build. They're just going to sit and wait. But I don't have the magic formula or the magic recipe as to how do we get more building starts and get them better until we have those early adopters. And we're trying to do the early adopting. Unfortunately, we feel sometimes like those salmon swimming upriver where an eye is out, a tail is missing as the early adopters. It's painful. But you need to have a thick skin and keep going and just don't give up. Keep waking up the next day and going to work, even though yesterday was hard and you're sitting most of the time convincing people. So that's why I was trying to say storytelling. Make sure that you got the best thing that you can to convince people to change. I don't know if that is making things easier or making things more complicated, but everyone has to move forward.
I think that's the perfect place to end. Thank you so much, my expert panelists and the engaging audience. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.